and welcome to our very first Heritage Shorts Document Detective presentation. I'm Larry Cates, a reference librarian at the Heritage Research Center of the High Point Public Library. These little videos are intended to introduce you to how we perform research and how the resources we have right here in our facility on the second floor of the High Point Public Library can be used to crack mysteries. Also, I shouldn't omit the years of staff experience in interpreting documents and finding out more about the parties and the events involved. That knowledge, too, is an important resource for our patrons. Sometimes issues can't be solved by just searching through Google or another search engine or conducting an overall search of Ancestry.com. Those approaches might be helpful in some situations, and the answers could be online, but they may also be, that is, the answers may be buried in books or located on maps or in records that no one has indexed completely, or more than likely a combination of all of those things at one time. Also, you may not know at first what parts of Ancestry or Family Search or which other websites are most likely to help you with a given situation. And that's where our collections and our experience come in. So do consider paying us a visit. Today's example is more a historical mystery than it is a genealogical one, but it will have implications for somebody's genealogy, that's for sure. We have a good friend in town, Paul Payne, who likes to collect old things from the locality and find out what they mean. These are documents that have belonged to private individuals for the most part. They've been kept in attics and storage buildings, tucked into family Bibles, stored in cigar boxes, trunks, outbuildings, or garages. And Paul just sweeps those things in and brings them in to us. He has a nose for locating and acquiring them. Well, a few months ago, Paul brought us some very special documents that you see in front of you here. I made copies of them, and he said he thought that they were evidence of what might be the very first recorded murder charged in the county of Guilford, which is the county where High Point is located. And boy, that sure got me excited because I have an acute interest in criminal matters. In fact, I've been transcribing and indexing the state dockets of Guilford County, which cover criminal cases in this locality from 1811 to 1868. And I published 4 books for the Guilford County Genealogical Society, taking those records up into the 1830s. Those are now for sale on lulu.com, and all the proceeds benefit the Genealogical Society. But this murder that I'm talking about, it happened far earlier than any of the minor criminal cases that I've been dealing with. It took place in 1772. Now, before we dive into those documents, I want to talk a little bit about the context. First, we need reminding that Guilford County only goes back to 1771. It was formed in that year specifically because of something we call the Regulator Movement in the Piedmont of North Carolina. It took place in the late 1760s and ended in a battle at Alamance in the neighboring county of Orange, now Alamance County. Though it wasn't really much of a battle. And it was when armed regulators confronted the governor's troops that he had mustered. They were fighting against corruption and in local government and the land grant process, but he made pretty summary work of them. They scattered pretty quickly. It really wasn't that much of a battle. It's a fascinating story about the regulators. The battlefield is today a state historic park that you can visit, but there are really 2 great books that have been written about the whole struggle recently that you should look into if you really want to know more about that struggle. And here they are, Farming Dissenters and Breaking Loose Together. And I think Breaking Loose Together is a mini masterpiece, actually. But the idea arose in the aftermath of that battle that forming a new county around the area where so many regulators lived would bring local government closer to the people and would divide the protesters further so they wouldn't be able to organize as easily as they did the first time. So the county's creation was really kind of a concession at the same time that it was a prophylactic against future unrest at the same time. So before Guilford County was formed, you had to go to Hillsborough in Orange County or Salisbury in Rowan County to conduct your public business. And this is a map, a snippet of a map of North and South Carolina that shows it from the very time we're talking about in the early 1770s. Salisbury was the seat of Rowan County, which covered about the western 2/3 of what became Guilford County, and Hillsborough was the seat of Orange County, which covered the eastern third of the subsequent county of Guilford. Both of those counties date back to the early 1750s, and the very first habitation by Europeans of this area probably dates to about the 1740s. So technically, we cannot say that this is the first murder that took place in Guilford's territory. Certainly it's not. There's a lot of history that precedes the formation of the county, but it might very well be the first murder that took place under Guilford's jurisdiction. It happened only 1 to 2 years into the county's existence. Now, knowing when counties are formed is always an important part of any genealogical or historical research on a local level. Records don't follow into new counties when they are formed. They stay in the place in the mother county, and so different time periods that you're studying can mean looking into the records of different jurisdictions, right? Here's a map that shows what the Piedmont counties looked like prior to 1771. And then we also have to consider how things developed subsequently. In 1772, Guilford was a lot bigger than it is today. It stretched all the way north to the Virginia border and much further south to Anson County's northern border, which is now the northern border of Montgomery County. In the back end papers of a book called North Carolina Research, there's a series of snapshots of what the counties looked like at various points in time in North Carolina's history. But there are also many digital resources that can show you what county boundaries were like in the past. I pulled for this presentation some maps made by J.D. Lewis on his website, carolana.com, carolana.com. They had the advantage, I thought, of being very clear to the eye and easy to see. So in 1779, Randolph County was cut off from the bottom third of Guilford. And in 1785, just 6 years later, Rockingham County was divided off in the north. And then finally, we have a modern recognizable Guilford County. If this murder had taken place prior to 1771, we would have to be talking about either Rowan County or Orange County. And if it took place post 1785, it could very well be in either Rockingham or Randolph, as well as Guilford. So we'll have to find out which it was, won't we? So now let's look at each document in turn. Each will tell us a little something else about the situation that unfolded, and each is a different aspect of the court's interest in the matter. Now, it would help, before we even start, to take a look at Helen Leary's great edited work, North Carolina Research, that I alluded to earlier, and the chapters on court records and criminal records in particular, both at the county level and on the higher court level. Each chapter was written by an expert in the field, so it's a highly reliable source. This resource helps us to understand what the court is trying to do and which court had authority at this particular time over a situation like this. Then we can also find out from Leary where the records are located that would help develop our knowledge further. Now, one of our documents is what we call a summons for witnesses, or before you can tell anything about what happened, you have to be able to read the documents, right? And of course, not only is every scribe a little different in how he forms his letters, but in this case, he's using particular conventions for making letters, rules for capitalization, symbols, abbreviations, formatting, and punctuation, different that we might employ today. Still, this writing is not so alien from modern letter forms. You could probably make out most of what it's saying without a lot of difficulty. The signatures will be the main problem. And if you need more coaching, there is a separate program on this very channel about handwriting and decrypting old handwriting, which is an essential skill. Now, eventually, artificial intelligence is going to catch up and be able to read a lot of the old handwriting, but I doubt it's ever going to be perfect. And for now, we really do need those skills to do our genealogy or local history research. We can't just rely on what other people have transcribed, abstracted, or indexed for us to get everything out of a document or to get it accurately, because people make mistakes with these old documents all the time. Even experts make mistakes. In the meantime, you can improve your skills with practice and also come get some help from us. But I've made it easy for you in this case because there's a transcription on the right-hand side of the screen. So here in the first document, the court is memorializing that 5 individuals have been bound on the 9th of July, 1772 to give testimony in a case in which one Nancy Purcell of Guilford County is accused of murder. And look where these witnesses are bound to go. They have to go all the way to Salisbury Superior Court in Rowan County in September of 1772 to give this testimony. And there are their names right there. The 5 individuals are Charles Baker, Richard Henderson, Joseph Ford, Samuel Johnson, and John Nix Jr. First of all, this is not a bond. This is not the bond itself. That document would have had all the witnesses' signatures. This is just a record of the transaction. It was probably made for the local court in Guilford or for an attorney in the case. The original bond probably went into the records of the Rowan Superior Court, District Superior Court, in the county next door. But why a bond? Well, a bond is basically a promise to a court. It's either to perform some duty or requirement or to refrain from doing something like breaking the peace. As in any promise, there's going to be a penalty if you don't live up to the standards of the promise, and that is the fine involved. In this case, the 5 witnesses will have to pay £100 each if they don't show up in Salisbury on the appointed day and give the testimony that's required of them. That would probably mean that some of them, if not all of them, would lose their land if they didn't comply, because cash was in short supply at the time, and land was the most valuable thing that people owned. So if a court levies a fine against you, it's unlikely you're going to have enough cows or personal implements, tools, household furnishings to cover the cost of £100. It's probably your land that's going to be seized and sold. So this is a grave matter. Usually a bond includes the main person making the promise and 2 or 3 securities or sureties who are also liable to pay if the principal person making the promise cannot or will not perform the duty and cannot pay the penalty. Now here, there don't seem to be any securities. The witnesses are just bound to come in and testify, potentially acting as securities for each other. We just don't really know because this doesn't tell us. Now, if the murder took place in Guilford County, defined according to its 1772 boundaries, why did the case get heard in Salisbury in Rowan County? Well, in this case, it's because before the first decade of the 19th century, the superior courts who heard felonies only sat by district. They did not sit in individual counties. Each county did not have its own superior court. So each superior court, seated in a principal courthouse town, had oversight over a number of different counties. As this map that comes from North Carolina Research shows, although this is from 1790, so there were more districts later on and there were more counties than there were in 1772. But at this time, the entirety of Guilford, from including what's now Rockingham and Randolph counties, was part of the Salisbury district, and that's why this case was to be heard there. Now, this is quite a lengthy and imposing document, the second of the three that came in with Paul that day. It's appropriate that it looks important and formal because it has very ominous consequences for the defendant. It goes on for quite a while. It's also pretty clearly written again and easy to read. It was filed in September of 1772 in Salisbury to formally charge Ann Purcell. It's what we call an indictment, and it follows the form that most any indictment for murder would at the time, with a lot of stilted language. It's an official charge made by a grand jury which has already determined that there's enough evidence to proceed with a case against her. And despite the ponderous language, there are a few bits of very interesting and pertinent information. Note that her name is spelled very differently than before. First of all, I thought her name was Nancy, but it's Ann, according to this document. Well, Ann is a very frequent nickname for Nancy, believe it or not, along with Nanny or Nan or Annie. It's really important to know all of the nicknames that were used in former times. In fact, we have books here that show you what nicknames are from various common Christian names from that period. And her last name, too, is a little different in this document. They invert the R and the U from Purcell to Prussell, but don't let that throw you. Spelling errors and phonetic spellings of names are common in old documents. People spell the way they heard or spoke, and even though they don't spell it the way you would today, you should pretty much ignore that and assume that we're dealing with the same person in the context that we have. The document tells us that Ann shot her husband on the 4th of July, 1772, with a rifle and a lead bullet. It states that the bullet actually entered the body in the left thigh. He did not die immediately, it says. He actually died on the 8th of July, so he lingered for 4 days. And it says that it happened in the 12th year of the reign of King George III, instead of giving us the actual year. In colonial times, it's good to remember that that's frequently how a year would be indicated, by the regnal year of the king who was in office at the time. And you might have to find out what the coronation year was and count forward in order to determine what the actual year would be. Also, this is an offense on behalf of the king against Nancy or Ann. Today, a criminal case is couched usually as state versus the alleged offender, but at that time, the king was the head of the state, and so the prosecution is brought in his name, as in King versus Ann Purcell, or Rex, which is the Latin for King versus Ann Purcell. And note that one phrase in this document calls this matter treasonous, and you might be perplexed by that, but yes, this particular crime or murder is not an ordinary murder according to English law. It is also what we call petty or minor treason. That may seem funny to you, but an attack on a husband or a master, the head of a household, is considered like an attack on a king or a lord, because the law places the husband or the father as the sovereign of the family. It's especially egregious killing because of that, and why it's labeled in this way in the document. But I saved the best for last. This document is the hardest to read, but it's also the most interesting one. It's a written summary of evidence gained on the scene on the day of the attack, on the 4th of July, 1772, and before the death of John Purcell on the 8th. Note that the different spelling of the name here, too. Already it seems that those present knew that he would die soon. Perhaps she had caused some irretrievable damage to his femoral artery, which would have caused him to bleed profusely, and they knew he was going to die. A constable or justice of the peace responding to the scene probably wrote this document. It's like a police report, and the person recording it was pretty poorly educated, clearly, as we would expect in backwoods North Carolina at a time when there were no schools. The person is probably pretty shaken up too, because he's taking this evidence at the place that it happened, shortly after it happened, And he's right there on the scene of the crime on that day. But this document tells how the dispute between them began over his coming home after midnight and her reproaching him because she felt he might be carrying on with other women. And then in the bedroom, because of all this reproaching, he says he struck her. She threatened him and ran to an outbuilding where a gun was kept. He had one of his children in his arms going after her, and there was a standoff which ended in a mortal wound. And he told her, by the way, that she did not know how to use the gun, but I guess she showed him. Amazing detail here, though no witness is specifically named. But he was still alive, and she was there, and maybe both of them were able to give some of this evidence. Marital bliss, right? As rare then as it is now, but really quite sad when you think about the children who were there, and one actually in his arms when he was shot, and their father dying just a few days later. I mean, how would they fare? Father dying could mean certain poverty at this time for orphans, not to mention psychological scars, of course. So this was quite a grave and dire matter. So what do I want to know about the matter that isn't spelled out in the documents that Paul brought to me? That's what I have to ask myself now. And also I have to figure out what I can reasonably expect to find, because not everything has survived. Well, I definitely kind of want to find out who these people are and where they lived. And I definitely wonder what happened to Nancy and the children. Did the court convict her? Who were her children? There are several sources that I might consult to answer those questions. First of all, records, especially minutes of the Salisbury Superior Court, seem like they would help. I happen to know that all of those were transcribed years ago in Joe Whiteland's serial publication, the journal that she put out called The Rowan Register, over many years in little pieces. That was a magazine of Rowan County genealogy that we have on our shelves here. There's no overarching index. You have to search end-of-year indexes for each year in which she published some of those records. But it turns out the records of the court itself are kind of spotty. The original minutes skip over this period of September 1772. So they're unfortunately missing. They're not going to tell us whether she was convicted or not. And the loose court papers are almost non-existent for Rowan courts prior to the Civil War. The dockets, which provide summary information about cases, are better preserved and offer some hope that we could get the judgment from those, but they aren't digitized. Those are only available if you go to the state archives. I can find out all that information by consulting the North Carolina Division of Archives and History's guides to state agency records, which the District Superior Court records fall into, or their guide to county records, which the Rowan County records would fall into, or the Guilford County records. These are in print in our collection and on the archives website. They have been digitized so that you can look at them. You can see exactly what categories of records they have for what years. I've highlighted the problem areas. It's unlikely I'll be able to determine whether Nancy was acquitted or what her punishment was if convicted without going to Raleigh, and maybe never, because it might not even be there. Likewise, there is unlikely anything to be found in the Guilford County records, rather. Almost all of those were destroyed in the firing of the courthouse at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse during the American Revolution, except for Deed Book 1. That's all that remains from the first decade of Guilford County's history in its local records. So that means that we are probably not even going to be able to determine for sure whether this was the first murder ever charged in the new county. It certainly could be, and it was one of the earliest. It's certainly the earliest documented to date. Anything else that survives would have to be at the state level. Tough breaks, right? It is possible that if Nancy was convicted, that a petition would have been gotten up for her, for the governor to give her clemency. And that seems likely given the evidence that we have and her gender, which would have made an execution kind of a horrible thing for most people to contemplate at the time, given their gender expectations. So I would search in the governor's letter books for the time period and petitions submitted to him for reference in this matter. That endeavor will require a trip to the state archives, although some early papers of the governors have been digitized for North Carolina on their digital site, on the archives digital site. However, because Josiah Martin was the last of the royal governors of North Carolina, some of his papers may have gone with him when he was evacuated out of the state. In fact, according to the North Carolina Encyclopedia, we find that many of his papers are now held by the British Museum in London. So that's a lot of legwork to get to the bottom of that particular question. What we can probably do right now, realistically, is try to find out something about the victim and possibly those children. Was the name Purcell or Purcell? Where in the new county of Guilford did they live? Well, we can look prior to and after 1771 for that information. And we need to look in the records of Rowan, Orange, the predecessor counties, and in Guilford, and its daughter counties of Rockingham and Randolph counties. For most counties that existed in the 17th and 18th centuries, lots of work has been done on abstracting, indexing, and publishing the early records, and that's what I did. I made a survey of all those books we have on the shelves for the time period in question in all those counties. And to guide me, I have the name of the victim and the murderer, and I have names of witnesses who may have been neighbors, and some of them most probably were. And in the end, I determined that the name is Purcell and that the family lived in Rockingham County. They lived in the western two-thirds that was part of Rowan. Here on the left, that is prior to 1771, here on the left is a 1768 tax list for Rowan made by, she did the transcription, Joe White Lynn did, and it shows John Purcell having a poll tax paid on his behalf by one David Purcell. Now that means that he was probably a subordinate in this household, but over 16 years of age in 1768. A poll or a head tax was the predominant form of colonial taxation in North Carolina. Land was not usually taxed at this period. Working people were taxed on their persons. That includes enslaved people and free males between certain ages, 16 and maybe 60, and it varies from different year categories to others. And slaves were taxed on their persons for a longer period of time during their life cycle. But we cannot be sure from this record. We can only see that John was in David's household and subordinate to him in 1768. It doesn't clearly tell us that he is the son, just that he's in that household and David paid his poll tax for him. What clinches this matter is David Purcell's will, which was filed in Rockingham County in 1788. Remember, Rockingham was formed from Guilford in 1785, just a few years prior to that. And look at this provision from the will. I give and bequeath unto Sarah Purcell and John Purcell, children of John Purcell deceased, 8 shillings current money. What a tiny bequest that was. I wonder what happened there. Did their mother get clemency? Was he afraid that she would get control of whatever inheritance he gave to them? Or maybe he had already given them something, as he had for many of his children, and was mainly concerned about providing for a younger set of children by a second wife, Elizabeth. And note that below there is another son of David's named John, who got part of the land. He calls him John Purcell the Younger. He was so grieved, apparently, that his elder son was murdered, he named another son, born afterwards, John, to keep that name alive in his immediate family. And of course, we can also look at deeds and land grants in Rockingham County and find out precisely where they lived. It turns out on Great Rock House Creek. Here is a grant in 1784 for the land that David Purcell left to his younger children in his will, which you can find in North Carolina landgrants.com on that website or on ancestry.com. And the deeds and Rockingham court minutes all are abstracted on our shelves. They will show how that land was disposed of eventually, and more details about this family touched by a violent tragedy. Finally, I will say these records brought in by Paul were probably preserved in a local magistrate's or lawyer's papers, the Martin family, also connected to Rockingham County, which explains why they were held privately. Alexander Martin, if you'll remember, was the Deputy Attorney General who drafted the indictment in this case. So these may be his copies of the proceedings, and he was a resident of Rockingham County. So that's where this journey ends for now. We can find out more about the people caught up in this tragedy, and there is likely even more to be found with determined digging. But we must thank our lucky stars that these records, though not surviving in public repositories, have been preserved in private hands all these years and then came into the possession of someone who really treasures history and was willing to share this little piece of it with us here in High Point. I hope I've taught you a few little things about the situation at the time and aspects of county formation, the agencies of government involved in the case, the language used in the documents, and where they're held today, and where abstracts and indexes are available to help provide contextual information. Don't hesitate to contact us and arrange an appointment. Come see what we can do to help you with your research.